Well, I've mentioned this a couple of times leading up to discussion of the music, and that is this idea of from craftsmen to artists. And so I wanted to take just this video to just delve into that a little bit more and kind of give you a sense of what I mean by that. Let's first start with the idea of authenticity as it applies to popular music. We have in rock music, really ever since about this time when all of this is starting to formulate, an idea of what authenticity means. If you're authentic as a musician, it means that you write your own songs. Your songs are really about who you are. You're not putting something on or trying to be somebody that you're not. There's a sense of sincerity and honestness and sharing and self-reflection and philosophical, perhaps kind of awareness that goes on. And so you're thought of as authentic if you do your own music. Now, remember, this is in a music business that up to this point was basically geared around people being songwriters and other people being performers and other people being studio musicians, you know. And so the people who played on the records had one job, the people who sang on the records and performed the songs on stage had another job, and people who wrote the songs had yet a third job. Now we're talking about authenticity being the same person being involved in all of those things, playing their own accompaniment, their own guitars, their own drums, not using studio musicians, you know, singing their own music and writing their own songs. And in many ways, the Beatles and Bob Dylan really helped to establish this idea of authenticity in rock music. And again, we've talked about the Dylan influence on the Beatles here. It's interesting because already by 1966, when the Monkees came along as the kind of American answer to the Beatles of A Hard Day's Night, they were really severely taken to task because they didn't write their own songs, although Mike Nesmith, the guitarist in the group, had songs and actually ended up having a hit song with another artist. But they didn't write their own songs. They were written by professional songwriters in the Brill Building tradition. The music was all played by studio musicians, and they were seen as inauthentic or kind of constructed and phony because they didn't really do it themselves. It's funny because just a year earlier, 2 years earlier, it was actually standard practice for that to be the way all rock musicians operate. The Beatles were something of an exception, though not the only one. You think about the LA scene, Los Angeles scene in the 60s, and there's a fantastic book and documentary out about the Wrecking Crew. The whole story of the Wrecking Crew was that you had a bunch of studio musicians who played on all of these records, and songwriters who did a lot of the songwriting, and then the musicians. In fact, the first Byrds hit, Mr. Tambourine Man, was played almost entirely by studio musicians, except for Roger McGuinn on the electric 12-string. Yet, this idea of authenticity has already taken hold enough by 1966, by the fall of 1966 into 1967, that the Monkees can be taken to task for being inauthentic because they were basically doing what most pop musicians in LA have been doing for years without any complaint. So that's why it's important to see where this idea of authenticity really starts up. And I think it starts to happen in '65 with the Beatles and Dylan together, really sort of pushing this idea, inspiring one another. Eric Clapton got a lot of his sense of respect in the eyes of a lot of fans, not only because he's a fantastic guitarist, songwriter, and singer and all that kind of thing, but because when he was with the Yardbirds, he actually walked out of a session and refused to play because they were doing a song by a professional songwriter using studio musicians, and he walked out and said, "I don't want to do this anymore, this is too pop," and he went on to play in the John Mayall Band, where they basically did blues. And the whole idea was that Clapton stood up for this notion of musical authenticity in the pop world and was willing to forego millions of dollars in stardom to be authentic. Of course, he later formed Cream and had millions of dollars in stardom, but that's another story. He definitely, this idea of authenticity, very strong, and this is happening in 1965 with the Beatles, who are at the forefront of it. When I say artist versus craftsman, or craftsperson generally, but since we've got 4 male Beatles, they are definitely craftsmen. What I mean is that a craftsman is happy to repeat the same construction principle over and over again. There's nothing that seems more absurd than somebody who builds, say, tables for a living, saying, "Oh, well, I have built a beautiful, well-constructed table. I couldn't possibly build that table a second time. I'd just be repeating myself. No, once you figure out a good way to build a quality table or whatever it is, woodworking, whatever, you repeat that because it assures a certain sort of consistency of quality. There's an element of craft there, and being able to promise that quality and provide it is the mark of a good craftsman. In fact, that's the way most popular music was thought of. You know, it was a kind of a craft. It wasn't artsy and highfalutin like that. You tried to put out a good pop product that you hoped that people would buy, and if you had success doing it one way, you just kept doing it until people stopped buying it. On the other hand, you have the idea of an artist. In classical music, say, the worst thing you can say about a classical composer is, oh, that composer is just writing the same piece over and over again. It means that that person is so lacking in originality and creativity that they just keep doing this, going back to the same formulas again and again. It's a sign of weakness. That's maybe even a kind of hint of a certain lack of competency. So an artist always wants to be pushing forward, always trying something new. Well, you can see that these are very opposed kinds of approaches. The craftsman finds the best way to do something and repeats it. The artist does something and then doesn't want to repeat that. If they're going to go back to a similar kind of artistic problem, they need to solve it in a different way or do it in a way so they're not repeating a past success. And so this idea of moving from the craft model, which is where the Beatles were 63 into 64, into the art model, which is the more 65, 66, 67 model, is exactly what we're watching happen here, where we find individual solutions to musical problems, to songwriting problems and topics, these kinds of things. And I'll be picking these out as we go through the music. You also see the Beatles pushing the envelope, using other styles, instrumentation, this kind of thing, all to create something that is seemingly new every time you get it. During this period, you know, when you got Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, it seemed like you were getting an album where the Beatles were doing entirely different kinds of things than what they'd done before. Now looking back on retrospect, we can see the continuity, but at the time, it seemed like they were really going in all kinds of crazy directions. I mean, if you look at an album like Sgt. Pepper, that's an album that never, according to industry wisdom, would never have been released, because one of the sort of basic laws of pop music at the time was every band has to have a trademark sound. But on Sgt. Pepper, it sounds like a different band on every track. That's exactly what you don't want to do, but that's exactly what the Beatles were doing. So we're on the road to that kind of thing, and on the artist, moving from the craftsperson model to the artist model. One thing I'll come back to time again is whenever the Beatles need a hit single, there are a couple places where in their career where they need to come back and they need to top the charts. They know how to plug in that craft model again and crank out, you know, a big hit when they need it. And what you'll find is they often go back to the AABA forms and some of the stuff from earlier in their career to be able to make that happen. So now, having talked a bit about this idea of the movement from craftsman to artist and this idea of rock and pop authenticity, let's move on to the music itself and discuss the album Help.